Alright, so this time around let's start on the back, get this trimmed and glued down, and then we can get over to setting up for the stitching. So as before, right, you see a wrinkle, you work it down, and you keep kind of working in that direction. So since this is already kind of there, find the seam where it overlaps the other bit of leather, right, and use that as a guide. Basically, alright, same thing as before. We'll do that. We'll cut that out. And once we cut this out, we'll glue this down. And now it's nice and up to the edge, right where it needs to be. Then we'll keep doing that and work our way around. Alright, so pretty happy with that seam. That lines up exactly as it should. So that will get glue, and then we'll move from there. And just keep working it down. Might not be a bad idea to relieve this leather a little bit further, just to help me get there, right? So say I got somewhere about here. I'm coming up to the seam and then making sure I'm leaving material past the seam. Alright, again, this is to relieve tension in the leather. The more that you do, the easier it is to kind of get it to conform. And it just makes the rest of the process a little bit more accurate and less of a headache. So keep that in mind. It's always a valuable thing, is to just make the process less of a headache. Alrighty, that just wants to sit down so much more on the surface, which is exactly what you want to see. So much easier once you relieve tension from the leather. It's crazy. It just gives in with much more ease. I've definitely got to glue this down so I can work properly and get the rest of this done. I feel like there's a little bit less need for that in between the other spokes. This will seat much more easily, looks like. Yeah, much more easily. Alright, so I'm gonna go downstairs and just finish that process and glue it down. So glued stuff down overlapping, kind of used my nail to score a line there, then I drew it with the leather marker. Now I'm just going to take an X-Acto knife and cut away at it. Figured it would be the easiest. Definitely when I was lining up the front, because this foam is kind of odd, it like snags the blade and it wasn't a good enough, you know, kind of way of getting the front lined up. But once the front is there and it's glued, then the leather itself kind of helps to guide the blade. Make sure that I cut in the right place. So I'm just gonna take this blade, kind of drop it into the seam, and then follow along the line. Just do this very carefully, kind of sawing the blade back and forth, if you will. Again, in the Supra, you don't really have to do this. You kind of can just slide that blade, but the material of this wheel, it is what it is. Whatever, like the Supra wheels, the Toyota wheels in general, have like a rubbery, you know, kind of material that is harder than this. And so blade slides right through there in a really nice way. It really does with this stuff. Kind of have to saw back and forth and really work it. So, but either way, you can make it happen. As you can see, getting a nice seam here. I'm going to do that all the way around, and we'll have a nice steering wheel. Rock. Definitely going to be critical here as I come over this part. I feel like I'm going to relieve this leather even more. It's not really playing ball right now. A lot of this stuff is just doing it by feel, right? Watching the leather, observing how it's folding, and then adjusting for it. You know, and if you see that there's, you know, tension in the material that's keeping it from really conforming to the curvature, then you go and you relieve some of that. So definitely this is, you know, there's obviously science behind it, behind why the material behaves as it does, but for the most part, as you experience this, you'll experience it as an art, right? Like, it's something that you just have to get a feel and an eye for and take your time and really work on. Like, there's certainly some things you can do that are wrong, but for the most part there's no one right technique. You kind of just gotta find your vibe, your style with this and work. I think I can try to glue this down and then cut the seams now. Same thing that I showed you earlier, all the way around this thing, gluing down seams in the corners and like wrapping leather around here to hold it nice and firm, and did that all the way around, came down, did it at the base. So now the leather's fully fitted, which means it's time for me to start stitching. Now I won't glue down these seams just yet, because when you start the stitching and when you end the stitch on another side, you want to be able to tuck under here, so you want these to stay loose. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mark the seams for the width that I want my holes to be at. In other words, the distance I want my holes from the seam in the center. And then I'll go and make my holes at the distance that I want them hole to hole. So I'm going to do a baseball stitch on this. It's the stitch that I like to do. If you want to do like a Euro stitch, for example, you would have to peel all this leather off, put this leather through a sewing machine and sew 2 seams, right, all the way around, 2 lines of stitching, my bad. And then you'd have to refit it and then come back with a needle and another string and, you know, tether between the 2 of them in order to make the pattern. So you can see there's a really tight, as you can tell, this is a long, arduous process, especially after you've spent all this time fitting this and getting it so nice. It's usually not impossible, but it takes quite a bit of work to really mold this back on to the same like degree of closeness and perfection of fit a second time. So I can do it. I've done it before. It's just, it's a buzzkill, and honestly, I just like the way the baseball stitch looks. If you're looking at, if you're doing a European steering wheel, like for a BMW, like by all means, yes, Euro stitch it. But if you're doing a JDM car, like 90s, early 2000s JDM car, all of those had baseball stitching from the factory, right? Like baseball is like one of the most popular sports in Japan, and like that's carried into the way that they stitch these things. If you look at even like the brand new like GR Corolla, for example, it has baseball stitch leather on its steering wheel, shift knob, e-brake handle. It's kind of the period correct and JDM correct way of stitching these things. So I'd like to stick with that. I'm gonna go ahead and stitch it exactly like that. Now the factory Evo setup, they actually just glue this. They just sew a seam and glue this stuff down, and they never stitch in between. So you just have these straight seams that are literally just pointless stitching because they don't mechanically do anything to keep this on. Granted, the contact cement here is going to be doing a lot of that work, but the baseball stitch also helps to really like keep that leather on nice and tight. So I'm going to use this little piece that I 3D printed. It kind of just has like a little bit of a groove. It's like a little blade that can sit in the seam of the leather, and I'll mark on this side and get an exact distance all the way around. Alright, so I can just just pop that in there and trace with a pen, and I can just keep sliding this up all the way around and trace with the pen, and I'll have two lines, right, as I keep going back and forth, that will give me the exact width away from the seam that I want to have. Then when I'm done with that, I'm going to set this right here. I forget what this is called, but I will get you guys that information. But I learned this using this, right? Like, you'll just set this to the distance you want, like I said, 1/4 inch apart. Now just go along the line that I drew and just poke the holes, right? And that makes it so much easier than stuff I used to do, like using an awl or just a nail or needles. Big shout out to Koopy Salon. Koopy Salon taught me this. He put this in one of his videos. I asked him, like in the video you could only really see the edges of this, and I was like, what the heck is that he's using to get the equally spaced holes so perfect? I messaged him and he was really helpful, and he gave me the number, part number that he used, what it's called. I ordered the exact one that he uses. This is from Tandy Leathers. So this just makes your life so much easier, and I really appreciate people that are helpful when it comes to learning a craft. They're not trying to hide the secret sauce. So this is definitely something that's a game changer for me. This is the first time I'm going to use it, and I'm excited for it. So let's just go ahead and start first drawing out the lines, and then we'll come in with this and make the holes. So I'm going to set this thing really quickly. And the way that this works is it's kind of like spring loaded here. This is like acting as a spring. So you can compress it like that, and then you would turn this dial here, and that would kind of just lock it in place. So let's open it up. Let's bring it down to 1/4 inch, and then we'll tighten it. There we go. I'm happy with that. So that's ready to roll. Okay. So you've noticed that I've left a little bit of a gap in the seam. That just helps to pop this little tool that I 3D printed down in here. You could use any number of things to guarantee that you're getting the right gap. You could just sit here with a caliper, put it there, make a mark, 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 and then interpolate it all by hand. I kind of just draw a line like that, make a gap, draw another line, then I can come back later and just manually interpolate that. If you need a little bit, you know, more of an in-between, you can drop another one there. But that kind of gives you the idea of how I go about doing that, right? Because like now I can just connect the dots, if you will, and have a line. And that'll guide me on where I go ahead and make the holes with this thing, right? Because I'll just be doing this over and over. Right, so I've gotten all the way around this thing front and back using my little 3D printed doodad and just made these outlines. I did a lot of freehanding as well. So now I'm just going to go ahead and take my scribing tool and start making the holes. You will notice, right, that there's a couple little tick marks on either end, and they're made right along the top seam of each one of these things, the end of each one of these things. And the reason for that is simple. That's where I like to start my stitching. I want it right on that edge. I'm going to stitch straight across and then start baseball stitching all the way around. So I always do that. Now, I'm going to try this out for the first time. Never did it before. This is where I'm going to start my stitch. So place this here, place this one here, and just poke. And wow, that worked really well. Okay. Poke here, then poke here next, here after that. I'm just going to keep doing that all the way around the lines until the entire steering wheel has all the holes made. Then when I come around the other side, I'll start from the tick mark that I made to line with that, so that my holes, right, I always want to make sure that I have a hole directly opposite. It's very easy to get excited making these and then make the mistake of not having matching holes, and then when you're stitching it's a disaster. So always make sure that you keep that going uniformly. In order for stitching to be perfectly even, as I go along the backside, I want to make sure that every single hole has its mate, and the back of the steering wheel structure is going to get in the way of this tool, but I'm just going to kind of maneuver it within that to be able to get to the positions I need to get to and make the holes. But always make sure that there's a hole right next to the one directly across the seam from it, right? You want to keep doing that over and over, guaranteeing that they're lined up at about the same exact positions. You don't want them like further ahead or behind of where the one next to it is, because that always messes with the orientation of the stitching and makes stuff come out weird. Do it this way and you're careful. It's nice, and it's so much easier to do with this tool because the preceding hole always guides you and allows you to guarantee that you're keeping the same distance between them, and that's actually really, really nice. If you have to dial it back a bit to make sure the next hole is not too far ahead, you can do that simply by not pressing into the hole behind it too much, and kind of just, let's see, like here, just come off the far back end and pop it in. I'm really impressed with the convenience of this little tool. Okay. This stuff does get in the way a little bit, but it's okay. It's manageable. I can maneuver it within the confines of the back of the steering wheel and get it to do exactly what I need it to do. I actually count each time I poke a hole. I actually count each time as I'm poking a hole. The reason for that is that it just allows me to check that I'm making the same number of holes side to side. So now the bottom has all of its stitching holes made. I did the front row of the top, just got to do the back row of the top. Now with this one, I want my stitching to kind of start from the middle and work its way out, and each side is not the same set of strings, each side is a separate set of strings. So what I actually do with that is that I start from the spoke
right? Start poking from the spoke and counting all the way here. And in this case, I've gone 33 times and done the same thing from this side, and just where they meet in the middle, that's where my seam is going to be. So that's where I'm going to start sewing from. And you can see that that's right here. The gap is a little bit bigger than it is in the other spaces, but that's completely fine. That's going to look fantastic once there's a seam, a stitch across here, stitch across there, and right, baseball stitched all the way back. It's going to be pretty nice. So I'm going to do this side, and then we can start our stitching. Alright, so at this point, all of the holes are finished. So that means that I can start stitching, but before I do that, right, I want to make my life easier. I don't want to be fighting the needle through this leather. Right, like I made the holes, and definitely the needle can come through, right, but I have to fight it because I glued this leather all the way down to the seams. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this little spade tool, right, and I'm going to peel up my leather basically all around the end to just past, right, the holes that I've made, right? And the reason for that is simple. Once I do that, now I can easily pass a needle through here, because if I left it as is, I'd have to like fight the contact cement and try to push this needle in between contact cement, leather, and foam, right? And it's a big uphill battle to stitch this. It becomes very time consuming and difficult, harsh on your fingers, right? I end up using these a lot, these thimbles. So for this time around, I'm gonna save my fingers by doing this. And obviously the stitching will bring that back down, so I needn't worry about, oh, my edge isn't perfect anymore. And obviously before I start stitching, I'm going to clean off the leather pen. It's another little detail that you have to attend to. It's not the end of the world. Kind of rubs off with your finger, and I found that a little bit of water really kind of gets it off, at least from the face of the steering wheel. We'll see how it does on the actual leather. Let's try just running it like a blade. So keep going all the way around the steering wheel on either side of the seams, right? And I'll do that, and then once it's all nice and loose, I'll go back and tighten it down with the stitching. And at the very ends, I can probably just leave it glued down just so that it holds this nice where I want it to be. You know, it'll make it a little tough when I start stitching, but once I get through the body, it's a lot easier, and I'm okay with that, right? Like, if I leave the very end of the spoke glued down just so that it holds its form, it's not bad. You know, like I can fight it with my thimble, and then once I get into the body of the work, just everything's super fast. So let's go and get that done. So now it's time to stitch this thing up, and for that purpose I have these two blunt needles. The reason you use blunt needles for this is, one, if you use a sharp needle, you're liable to poke your finger when it works its way out of the leather, and two, a sharp needle is actually liable to snag as you're passing it through. So these tend to pass through pretty smoothly, which is why I use them. A lot of guys tie knots on their string. I don't like having a knot on the string because it's always a pain when you're pulling the string through the hole in the leather. The knot always makes it more difficult. So what I've done is I've just folded the string back and super glued it to itself. That just makes it a little bit smoother and easier to pass. Then if you were to look at the opposite end of the string, I've just tied a knot there. And that's gonna, you know, basically I'll pass the needle through into the leather, and that knot will sit at the back of the first hole, and I'll go stitching from there. So let me show you guys what I do. I use a baseball stitch technique. Alright, so here's where I'm gonna start stitching from the center at the top of my wheel and out towards the spokes on either side. So the stitching is gonna run in two different directions along the top. I've marked my center point, right, so that I know what holes I'm working with. And I'm just going to tuck this up under the leather. and we're going to come out of the hole that's here. So it helps to kind of poke it a little bit there, and then you can find the hole without too much difficulty. Alright, now some of these sometimes are a little tight, so I do like to just take a plier and just tug it through. And I'll tug it all the way through, and I'll let the knot just sit in there. Then I'll take the other needle coming from the other side. Right, here's my hole. Do the same exact thing. And pop my way out through here. Alright, tug it just like before. Bring it through. Now, what I like to do is I wrap this over and go in where the other one is. Alright. And I'll do that. Then in this case I'm going to bring the needle out that way. Okay, I'll tug this here. I'll go ahead and I'll bring my other string over right next to it. Pop it in. Make sure not to mistakenly poke the string through the string. You don't want to poke a needle through that string and then you'll have string within a string. It will mess you up. If you do it, you'll know what I'm talking about and you wish you hadn't. Alright, so let's bring this down nice and flat. Alright, and we'll tug this until it's nice and tight. So this is where I'm going to start stitching from. Right, so I've got this just like that, and I want to kind of tug them so that they're kind of at the same point. Now I'll come up, go to the next hole down on each, alright, and then pop these through. And from here on it gets a little bit easier just because I'm working from the outside in. Alright, so we'll tug these, and the thing to keep in mind is you're not guaranteed that these stitches are going to be even, right? So when you, even though the holes are, when you do this you want to kind of twist the strings and tug them and mess with the way the stitch is going to sit, just to make sure that it comes out as even as you can get it. And you want to leave the strings kind of even again. Otherwise, the head of the next stitch is going to be malpositioned. Let's call it that. Alright. So we'll do this, come through here, and I'll just keep doing the same thing over and over for quite a while. Right, until I get this entire thing stitched all the way through. But see here already, I'm starting to battle with where the head of the string is. I want to make sure that you play with that, and you want to make sure that as you're doing this you're tucking in the seams, right, so that you don't end up with like an overlap like that. You want the seams to kind of hit each other end to end and not one on top of the other. And you always tug it till you get a nice like ridge. Alright. Just like the seams on a baseball. Same look we're going for. It's better to tug this through with pliers than with your hands. One, because you'll save your fingers, and two, because you'll save your needles. You could actually bend your needle by yanking on it too much. So you want to kind of be careful and be wary of that. Always tucking in the seam. And obviously I'm doing this nice and slow just so you guys can see the pattern start to form and see what I'm doing when I'm doing this on my own a lot faster. So there, I made a key mistake. I had my arm on the rest of the string as I tugged with the plier. Obviously, the super glued end came undone. That's okay. I'll fix that. Let me just show you guys the next stitch. You always kind of just want to twist it and even it out. Make it nice and tight. You basically just keep doing that over and over until you're done. I'm gonna go and re-glue that needle in place, and then I'll come back and show you when I'm working my way around the spoke until the last part. So you don't gotta sit here and watch me do all the stitching in between. You get the idea. Alright, so I've stitched most of the way through. I just gotta keep going, get this corner done. So just keep building on what I've done. Definitely feel like a curved needle might help with some of this, but straight needles work just fine ultimately. So I have no complaints. Just tugging and making sure my stitch comes out as even as possible. Now we tie a quick knot. We tie another one. I like to go as far as tying a third. With that nice and tied, take our scissors and cut excess string off from in there. Now all of this section is done. Now I have to do the other section, and the entire thing is fully stitched. Right now I've gone all the way around this thing, and now it's fully stitched top and bottom. Only thing that's really left to do is to do some nipping and tucking around these areas and reinstall the little clips that go here, here, and here. Then I can reassemble this steering wheel, just pop the airbag back in and the clip, the little trim ring that goes around that, and this thing is going to be done and ready to ship off to its new owner. So if you guys have enjoyed this video, stay tuned. There will be a part 3 where I finish it and do final assembly, and there will definitely be another video that I'll link you guys to where this is getting installed in its final destination. If you want to see more videos like this, feel free to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you're notified when I post up another one. And as always, thank you guys very much for watching.